Okay, hello everyone. Well, turns out this is the 500th episode of live CEOing behind the scenes in real life software development. So hopefully this one's going to be really easy, he says. We are talking right now about the function CloudSync, and the objective is, okay, synchronization of local directories and cloud directories. Okay, but so this is a hard problem, right? Okay, now who's speaking here? Yeah.
Not too hard, hopefully. I mean, it's not trivial. There's some machinery in the background that needs to happen, but we have some ideas.
So, but I don't understand. For example, if you have a file open on your local computer and it synchronizes from underneath you, what's going to happen?
Oh, I see what you're saying now. Yeah. We're not really trying to solve any conflict resolution.
No, but what are we going to? What's going to happen? What actually happens if a file gets rewritten? A file is open in the operating system on your computer, and something comes in and rewrites it. What happens? Because that's what this is going to end up doing. Does it depend on the application, or what does it do?
Kind of, yeah, depends on what that process does if the file changes underneath. But
okay. But so for us, we're primarily dealing with notebooks. So the question is, what do we do when the file changes underneath?
Yeah, I think the front end usually detects that, and well, let me think. If it disappears, there is a special mechanism for that, and it shows a message.
Okay.
If it changes underneath, I think you would just overwrite that probably.
Well, okay, so just to understand, I don't think that is what I mean. What happens with things like Dropbox and so on is that, you know, it says, or at least in our application, what it does is to say, it renames it to untitled whatever, right? It renames the previously open file to untitled whatever. Now that may be our behavior, and then the other one just shows up with its new name. I mean, with its foo.nb type name. You got what I'm saying?
Yes, and that's part of the proposal here. If you scroll down a little bit, there would be an option override target, or maybe use something else, where you can choose what to do in that case. But it's basically a function of this CloudSync function, okay, when it detects that case.
Okay, so let me just understand what we're thinking this is going to do. So CloudSync, you can run it on a directory, and it will attempt to synchronize that directory in the sense that it will keep the newer version of every file. Is that correct?
That will be a sensible default, yeah.
But it's not going to try to resolve conflicts.
Well, certainly in other words, not, yeah.
But so what it should do by default is, there are cases in which it's safe. Does it know when it's safe to do that overwrite? In other words, if the file on system A had not been touched since, if they had forked, if no change had been made on system A after the fork and only system B had been updated, we know it's safe to overwrite. Do you get what I'm saying? Otherwise, it is not.
The question is, do we keep information about any sort of fork points? I'm not sure how easy that is.
Well, okay, so here's how you tell, right? So you know when each file was created, right? You have the creation date for each file. I mean, the last modification date for each file. If it is the case, I see. So the issue is when were they in sync? Okay, well, that depends on when CloudSync was last run. If we assume the only synchronization is through CloudSync, right? then if we know when CloudSync was last run and we look at the mod dates, we can tell whether it was okay or not.
We could do that. That was not part of my idea here, because that would basically make it stateful, right? So you keep information around on your local file system or somewhere that tracks when you called it last time and so on.
I think you'd have to do that. I can't see how it could work without that. I think you just corrupt files without that. Right? I mean,
we would never corrupt the file. We would always just take one or the other. So it's not like we would, within a file, that would be a problem.
That's not so obvious to me. If the file is open on one of the machines, it's not so obvious to me. Now, what happens if there is syncing to multiple computers? So in other words, what you've got is the situation like the one that I have, where I have multiple machines that I use, right? And it's got to, for every one of those machines, it's got to know, it's got to know when it comes back to life and so on. Can we in fact solve this problem or not? Or is this just going to be a mess where it keeps on breaking people's files? I mean, so, go ahead.
I mean, I agree that two-way sync is certainly harder. I think with a one-way sync, which is also useful, that isn't so much of a problem.
And why is a one-way sync useful? Other than as a backup to the cloud?
You could see it as a backup. You could also see it as a way to publish your whole local directory, or backing up your cloud files, or backing up, just copying your cloud files to your local system.
I understand. This is what I used to do more than a decade ago, before I started using these own cloud and Dropbox and all these kinds of things, right? This is what I used to do. And I mean, I used to have a separate set of directories that were, I think I called them portable or something. And they were always getting copied over, from one thing to another. It was pretty grotesque, actually. And not very useful. I mean, it was necessary because that was the only way to have something available on a local machine in many cases. All right, let's review this a little bit more. So the thing that we think we can do is just, if there's no file there, if it's just virgin territory, we can put files there. That's easy enough, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, if there is already a file there, and then there's all kinds of logic about whether we should overwrite, warn, make 2 copies, whatever else. But if this is going to be used as an ongoing synchronization, it's absolutely hopeless unless it can deal with the file already being there. Am I making sense?
Sure.
I mean, otherwise, it's just a backup, basically. And I wouldn't even call it a sync. It's just a, back it up to some place that hasn't been backed up before. Okay. And I don't quite understand. I mean, it's usually kind of complicated. If you've started to do a sync and then your Wi-Fi goes down, then have you blown away the file? I mean, that has to be done very carefully and atomically, so to speak. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
Otherwise, you could end up with a situation where neither file is there and where you just lost your data. So I don't quite know how to do that. I mean, that means that it has to be local to, I don't know how to do that. And do we know how to do that? I mean, it seems
one way would be to download the file to some other place and then perform a move that does not depend on the network, at least.
Yes, and I understand that. That's probably a reasonable way to do it, although I don't know whether that's, one time in a million, that might fail because the machine crashes right when the move is going to happen. And the concept that we might lose somebody's files is really not an acceptable situation.
I don't know if you can shoot for being more reliable than the file system itself.
Perhaps not. Perhaps not. I mean, hopefully move is atomic so that it, okay, so now, okay, CloudSync to a cloud object directory, okay, CloudSync for cloud object directory to a local directory. Okay, but the question is, that's amusing to use the two-way rule. That's a cute idea. It's a cute idea. We haven't done that very much.
A little out there maybe, but on the other hand, it does make it very explicit. So I like.
We haven't. I think it's cool. I think it's a good design pattern. To a corresponding location in the cloud, yes.
That's also up for debate, of course, how exactly that should work, but that is something.
Well, I think it might want to go into something in the cloud that is called local sync or something, some such, or local files or some such other thing, or some other top-level wrapper that somebody could readily set as the top level of their file system in the cloud, but that isn't just the raw. I mean, I think both ways round, it should go by default into some folder. You know, you could set it to go to somewhere else, but by default, it should go to some folder that identifies what it is. You know, Wolfram Cloud files or something, and I don't know what, the documents directory or some such other thing should be the default, presumably. I mean, obviously you can tell it to go to some raw file system, raw place in your file system.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now the next question is this something that happens automatically, or when does it happen?
Right, so as far as this function itself is concerned, I was not imagining that. I was thinking of it as something you call and then it does its job and then it's done. But it could certainly be the basis for something that runs in the background, like a Dropbox thing.
Okay. What is this? Purpose of the function is to promote a potentially raw file.
So this is a bit of an extra nice to have, I would say. But right now we have that problem in the cloud where if you create a file directly with the kernel, not through cloud object operations, then it does not show up in certain cloud objects operations. Like the file explorer might not show the file, or if you ask for cloud objects open close, you would not get it, and so on. And that's because there's no metadata entry for it in our database.
I understand that, but so why aren't we showing a thing when you go to the cloud file system? Why aren't we showing a little little tile somewhere that says, you know, raw local files, and you click it and it actually runs file names and so on and shows them to you, even though they're not manageable as cloud objects. See what I'm saying? So it's not invisible.
We could do that. Yeah, to me, it's questionable whether it's worth that effort doing all that when really you want better synchronization.
I don't think you do, because I think that in many cases, those might be temp files that are coming and going and being written very fast. You don't want some crazy synchronizer coming in and saying, oh, let me go synchronize this file that just got overwritten 1,000 times. I'm making sense? I actually don't think it's a particularly good idea to expect to sync to those files. I think if you want files that are, you know, properly cloud objects, then make them cloud objects. And if you really want to be using the local temp, I mean, you're not going to synchronize the temp directory. That's like
for sure not. Yeah.
Right. That's like the famous story that I have been known to tell of, you know, you hire movers to move something, and they are meticulous, and they'll take a garbage can full of garbage and they'll pack the garbage and, you know, move it for you, which of course is the correct thing to do given the specification of move this, you know, whatever. Anyway, never mind. But I think this is one of these things where packing the garbage of what's in the temp directory does not seem like a good idea. And I mean, to me, the right design there is just literally some link, you know, from the file browser that just says, look at your local, you know, look at your raw local files. And it brings up a notebook and it shows you, you know, it literally just shows, or you just run something which goes and, shows you that, and it gives a link to some workflow where you can learn about how to use local file operations. That's what I think for that.
Could also work. I mean, even then, we would still need this function, I believe, where, you know, whenever you...
Which function?
Something that promotes a raw file to a cloud object, especially in that case where it's not automatic.
I think it's useful.
I would also say if it ever happens automatically behind the scenes, it would certainly not happen for the temp directory, and it would also not happen synchronously. It would be an asynchronous synchronization.
Right, which might be super confusing to people.
Maybe, but I think it's also confusing, to be honest, that you know, you just do a put to some file and then it never shows up in your file explorer. But
well, that's why you should do cloud put.
Yeah.
I mean, I really don't think that's and if you look at the file name for raw put, it'll be some weird file name, right? It'll be an actual file name. I mean, maybe what we should do is put into that file name something that basically makes it clear this will not show up in your cloud object directory. If that file name was you know, the analog of a do not reply email, you know, from line, right? What is that right now? What is the, let me just look at, oops, what did this just do? Hold on 1 second. Let me just go ahead and go to the cloud.
I'm not sure what you mean by the put name. I mean, you can specify whatever you want as a file name.
You know, the cloud has lost my login. Oh, well. Okay. No, but by default, what does put do by default if you don't give a file name?
Not just complain.
Let's find out. Creates an empty file with a specified name. Okay, so it requires a file name. Is there anything that doesn't require a file name? Well, obviously cloud, yeah, cloud put doesn't require a file name, but put does require a file name. I see. But does put return the what the heck does put return? Does put return
it's just null, isn't it?
What's that?
It's just null, isn't it?
I see. That's a shame. Because if it returned the name of the file, you would see the name of the file as some weird thing, right? And you would kind of know.
Or not. I mean, it's a little weird maybe, but it's still in your cloud home directory. That's where your cloud kernel is operating.
No, I understand that. What is the name of that cloud home directory? If I say $home directory here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but that's not the same. I mean, if I look at a cloud object, if I say,
it is, I think, if I anticipate your question. The raw file for the cloud object is in that same directory.
Okay, well then that's maybe the mistake. Maybe the home directory here, which I don't really understand. So that 9df, what is that?
That's just a bucket for your user UUID.
Okay, so maybe what we should do here is in that name of that home directory, we should make it clear that you know, by the naming of that directory, we should make it clear this is not a cloud object file. This is, we should call it, you know, local server files or something. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yes, and in some sense that's also something we considered at least.
But let's say it was called local server files. then that would give some indication to anybody that that isn't a cloud object.
And we're saying that's how the kernel would start with, basically. If you
That's
just
correct.
do a put, that's the default directory.
The home directory would not be /user files. It would be, I mean, it would be something like, local. Instead of that, it would say local server files there. Or something like that.
We did consider .files at some point. It would be kind of a hidden directory in your home directory.
Well, look, I don't think that's right. I think that the right place to put it is, I think the right thing to do is to signal that your home directory here is not a cloud object directory. You see what I'm saying? Your home directory is a local server files directory. Right? And if you said that, then people would not be confused that it's not a cloud object store.
I'm not even sure about that. I think people would still be confused if they do a cloud put and then a get on that, with the same name. I think people, at least by now, they would certainly expect that.
Cloud put is putting a cloud object, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the issue is that a get on that cloud object name will do the right thing. Everybody, that's all good. I could take this, right, and I could say get a %2, and I will get back test. It's all good, works just fine, right? What I'm saying is, the issue is people think that there is some correspondence, but I mean, nobody thinks that there's a correspondence between the temp directory and their cloud objects, do they?
Temp directory, no, but files, I think,
okay.
Yes.
Okay, but so fine. So what we have to do is show them this is not intended. Your local file system is provided for certain operations that you want to do that you do not want to put in a temp directory, but it is not intended as a permanent cloud object store. It's intended as a kind of a buffer area. I mean, what should somebody put in their local server files and not in a cloud object? What are they trying to do there? What's the point of those files?
It's, I don't think they have that much right to exist. It's because if you want something really fast, you should use a temp directory to begin with, not even.
Okay, so what should somebody use the local server files for?
It's basically, if you need something that works across different cloud compute nodes, but still you want raw file access for
fine. For some reason, okay, fine. So then let's call it local server files, and then you're getting something which is some kind of cache, and it isn't the cloud object store, which is the permanent thing. And if your home directory is a local server files directory, you kind of know that, what does it mean, local server files? It probably means, I mean, maybe that isn't the right name, maybe there's a better name for it, but it wants to indicate this is not intended to be the cloud object store. See what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the right thing to do. Now, I understand that means we would have to migrate people's home directories, but we're about to have a new URL scheme anyway, so we're going to have changes in that area. But I think that's a much better solution than some kind of syncing thing, which I don't think is going to work well. I think it's going to be something where people are constantly saying, oh, I've got this weird bug, it works most of the time, but it didn't work in this case because my files were updated too quickly and the sync didn't come through quickly enough. I think it's just asking for trouble. I think the right solution, because as you say, your argument is it's for specific cases, for speed, where you want to just access the local file system, right? It's not intended that that's where people store their files. Am I making sense? I mean, it's a sort of pseudo temporary area.
Right, if it is a separate area, yeah.
What do you mean a separate? Okay. What do you mean if? I mean, the only way to not make it if is to change the file system so that all files have the metadata to be cloud objects. which I don't think we want to do. Maybe at some point in the distant future that becomes possible.
Yeah, the problem that I see is basically right now it is the same area. There's some files that don't get promoted with the metadata, but it is
wrong.
It is
in my opinion.
Space,
that's
right?
just wrong. That was not properly thought out long ago, before the current team's time. I think the right thing to do, just like I've been pushing to have the published thing be a separate area, the right thing is to segregate these areas. Don't intermix the files. It's just crazy to do that. Just have an area called local server files that contains these things that are intended to be on the local file system, and do not put them in the same file system, same, directory structure place as the cloud objects.
Okay, so you're not too concerned about people currently relying on that, and then.
Well, I mean, we obviously have to think through what the bridge is, but there'll be some way to do it. Relying on the fact that they're in the same file system? What would they do relying on the fact they're in the same file system? What would they do that isn't kind of a crazy bug?
I mean, it's not too crazy. I think you would do cloud put to some named object. So you do cloud put 42, some
named object, and then you access it with raw file operations.
And then you do get my name. Yep.
Okay, well, fine. But I mean, you can. So why don't we do this? Why don't we say cloud put? If you were to say cloud put into the local server directories, it just puts a file there and it doesn't put the cloud metadata. Just goes blop, there's the file. No cloud metadata. No cloud permissions, nothing. Local server files is not something accessible in the cloud by other people, for example. It is a local server file for you. And if you cloud put to that directory, all you get is the raw file.
That's fine, but it's I'm more concerned about the case where somebody in the past or currently uses package to the cloud or some expression, and then in a cloud evaluation they use get.
Sorry, in the past, what?
They use cloud put to get something into the cloud.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the cloud evaluation, they use get.
You mean cloud evaluate? Cloud evaluate.
Not necessarily. It could be an API function. Or
okay, well, fine. So you know what? This Band-Aid has to be pulled off at some point.
Okay.
The idea of mixing things which are local files without metadata with files that have metadata in the same file system is kind of crazy. And, the fact that anybody did that was, the cloud object store, we have looked a bunch of times that should we upgrade the object store to something more like, to something that isn't a file system based object store. I have always opposed that because I think file systems work well, but nevertheless, were we to do that, that would completely break this, right? This correspondence between local files and cloud object files.
Yes.
So let's pull off this Band-Aid. Let's figure out how to do this, and let's figure out how to make it so that, newly created files, I don't know what we do for existing files. There's probably some way to make a bridge for existing files, but newly created files go in a separate area and don't get cloud metadata if they are put in that area. Does that make sense? And the files that are in the main cloud file system all have cloud metadata. So if you find a file there that doesn't have cloud metadata, it's wrong. It's a bug. Let's go look at this, okay? So, okay. What is all this about? This is...
You don't even need to worry about the REST API, I think.
Well, but it might be useful. I mean, that might be something which people could call, how does it do permissions and so on? So if you want to say, I want to put a file into, I want to have a piece of code that uploads a file, and it's some random piece of code that's just calling an API. Is that what you have in mind there or not?
With the API,
Yes.
The API is, I mean, in the first iteration, is there for our Wolfram language functions to talk to the server.
But is it intended to be user exposed?
In the end, yes, definitely possible.
Okay. Okay.
So I think one trick that's worth talking about is how we preserve metadata in the local file system. And the idea would be to use special hidden directories that contain that metadata.
Sorry, say that again for a second.
So, imagine you want to create an archive of your cloud objects that preserves permissions and all the other meta information that you store with a cloud object. Then the idea is to store that in your local file system in a hidden directory next to the primary content files.
Okay. Sorry, I'm sorry, I spaced out. I'm trying to deal with some other issue. Could you say that one more time? I apologize.
Sure. Maybe scroll down a little bit so that you see the next subsection as well. It gives you some idea. So when you synchronize something, you'll have files that are basically the content of the cloud objects, right? But then you might also want to preserve metadata like the permissions or other options.
I see. When you synchronize to the desktop.
Yep. And also the other way around. Later you might sync back to the cloud. Maybe even to a different cloud, right?
No, I get it. I get it. So the question is, well, what happens if there was, if Jim was a user on one cloud whose permissions you assigned, and that same name is somebody completely different, is evil Jim on another cloud? How does that work? Presumably, the cloud permissions would store the cloud
permissions. Yeah, they wouldn't make much sense. What would happen is basically the permissions themselves are represented using the user UUIDs. It's not like we store. So it's just very, very unlikely.
So until the UUIDs collide, when the universe ends, when the UUIDs collide anyway. So
exactly.
Right. Every atom of space has its own UUID, and if they ever anyway, never mind.
So are you talking about issues like I'm transferring between clouds and there's just different users I've given permissions to on one system, and you want to specify a mapping or something?
I think the mapping sounds incredibly ornate. I mean, I think you just have to reset the permissions when you've done the copy. But I agree that, if you think that you're caching, look, basically, if you think you are syncing, and the name CloudSync suggests this, you're syncing to the cloud, from the cloud to the desktop, you can push it back again to the same place. If you want to push it to a different place, that's a much more complicated situation. And to me, that relates to our whole attribute lattice permission system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It seems complicated, right? Because it seems like there are all kinds of security questions about, who can do, there's all kinds of horrifying things that could happen if you could start doing cross-cloud, cross-cloud permissioning, so to speak. I just don't think, as a matter of fact, that's something we should bear in mind when we're talking about these lattice-based permissions, because that's something that will be quite nice for our multiple internal local clouds to have the same permission structure. Would be, for most of them, would be good. So that's its own issue. But okay, so let's come back to this. I mean, I have to say I'm a little bit skeptical about this whole thing. Okay, I think it'd be wonderful, magnificent if it could really be done perfectly. I'm just worried that what we'll end up with is something which isn't quite trustworthy enough that one can really use it. Because I mean, okay, let's think about my use case, for example. Right now, I have lots of files that are sitting on synchronized across many computers through, whatever the generic name for, Dropbox-like services is. Okay. And, and it works very nicely. And it works, that's how I do all my work, basically. is there are, well, I have a network file system as well, and the network file system is scratchy. Has all kinds of issues. It reconnects on some laptop from somewhere and it then hangs and it does this and it does that. It's old technology. I don't like it very much. Okay, so to be able to use our cloud more, I would love it if some part of my file system was just synchronized to the cloud. Okay, but I don't know how realistic that is here. Now, let's imagine that there was a case. I just don't see, I mean, unless it's really trustworthy, it doesn't seem like something one would use. Because, my use case, all right, so let's talk about another use case, right? I get sent a notebook in email, okay? Right now, we have the Nice Player app on iOS that allows me to open it on my phone, okay? As a raw thing with the local player app. Now, the other possibility would be that somehow that thing, well, if it's a cloud file that's sent to me, then I open it in the cloud and the cloud app, and that's all good as well. How would this affect that? It wouldn't. I don't think that's not a relevant case. Sorry, I retract that. So the question there is, how good is this going to be able to be? I'm just really worried that it's going to be one of these things that isn't quite trustworthy enough. And then the question is, what is the fallback? What is the use case that still makes sense, even if it isn't, even if it's only, for example, okay, so the issue is this. So let me paint a picture that might make more sense, right? Let's say I have a directory of published files. And okay, I'll give you a use case, right? I'll give you a use case that actually might make sense and might be easier. Okay. Okay, I've got a directory on my local machines, and I want that directory to be auto-published to the cloud.
Yep.
Okay. So in particular, I'm working on a file. Maybe I'm doing it on some live stream, and I want people to be able to get that file in the cloud if they want to. See what I'm saying? And to get reasonably, every time I press save, I want it to be, see, that seems unrealistic. I mean, what you've got is you're not doing incremental updates, are you? I mean, in other words, if I have a 100 megabyte file and I keep on pressing save, what we're doing on the local machine is just incrementally updating pieces of that file. Whereas in the sync proposal that you're making here, that whole file in one go would be pushed to the cloud, correct?
On a per file basis, yes. It would be granular down to the file level. If there was a file that wasn't changed,
I understand that.
It wouldn't be copied, but yeah.
Right, but I mean, if I'm daemon pressing save on my local machine, and I guess the thing is, every 30 seconds is doing a sync, it's copying a big pile of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there's be some chance of optimizing that, pretty much like various backup utilities do, but that's probably wouldn't be a V1 feature.
I'm sorry, what? Once
that wouldn't happen right away, I think.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think this thing about keeping a published file in sync with my local version, that is somewhat useful. Okay, but that's a much more junior feature than the whole thing you're talking about here. In other words,
that's part of what I was saying. That it's the one directional sync, right? And that is useful on its own. That your local
copy but in particular,
is what you want.
Right, exactly. And there's no, I see. So that's the thing where it's a single arrow sync.
Yep.
Where it's basically the default is overwrite target.
Yep.
Well, I admit that that's useful, and it's particularly useful if you can say when you publish a file, if you can put something there, and we could implement that efficiently, that says keep this file in sync. right, if the publish dialog contained a checkbox, keep this file in sync. See what I'm saying?
I think that would be nice, even though that's not necessarily this function, really. I mean, that's...
Well, it's infrastructure for this function. Right. So in other words, you could say cloud publish, blah, 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 and then there would be maintain sync arrow true. Now, the question is, can that be implemented efficiently without something polling for the next 17 years? In other words, is there a message? And I don't know whether there is. I mean, is there anything that is generated? Yeah, I mean, the right way to do that would be, yes. The right way to do that would be to have something on the local machine, which is part of the save mechanism on the local machine that says, does this file have a tag that says it is going to be, that it is intended to be synced, right? And that tag, I mean, unfortunately, well, let me just think about this for a second. The problem is, how would you do that without modifying the local file? You could certainly put something into the local file, but if you had it in, see, there are many screwy things here, right? So let's imagine that you had an auto-syncing file. No, this can't work. This can't work, it can't work. Look, let's say I have that file synchronized across multiple local machines. I would get very confused. I publish the file from one machine. As far as I'm concerned, because I'm using, file synchronization automatically between my various machines, I don't notice, oh, I did that piece of work on this laptop, or I did that piece of work on this desktop machine, right? I just don't know. I have no idea. I don't think about it. And so the idea, oh, on this machine, I set it to be auto-syncing, but not on this other machine, is not something I'm thinking about. Do you get what I'm saying?
Right. I mean, that depends on where that's even stored, whether it's also auto-syncing or not, right?
I'm saying
of the notebook file.
No, yeah, right, exactly. But the problem is, if it's part of the publish dialog, right? Could the publish dialog modify the file? That's the question. Is that an acceptable thing? If the publish dialog can modify the file, then it's absolutely fine. Then the notebook file contains a thing saying I'm auto-syncing, and here's where I'm syncing to, right? I'm just thinking about this. I mean, right now, then that would be fine. Then every time you press save for that file, it would essentially run the auto-sync code, and then that would work.
I think it wouldn't be a disaster, maybe a little surprising, but an alternative would be to use that same .wolf from cloud directory later.
It can't work. Think about it. It can't work because, well, okay, I see what you're saying. You're saying that would be auto-synced across machines as well.
Yep. If you put that in a Dropbox, I'm pretty sure it would synchronize.
Yeah, I think it would synchronize too. All right, so that is an alternative. I agree. In other words, your point is if you sync the file, you sync the dot files as well.
Yep.
Okay, I agree that that's a possibility, and that might be more natural. Well, no, it's not a good idea. Well, I don't know. It's a complicated idea. So here's the point. Let's say you move one of those files. The dot file is not going to move with it. See what I'm saying? If you move the directory, it'll move. But if you move the individual file, if you drag the file in your Finder or whatever, it's not going to move. And I think that's super confusing. In other words, you move the file and it stops auto-syncing. I don't think that's right. I think it's better to put it in the file itself. And that probably means, that there's a button in the publish dialog that says, set this file to be auto-syncing, so that you know there's an action taken. You see what I'm saying?
Yep.
Okay, so then the workflow that we imagine here is there is a CloudSync that will take a whole directory, local directory, and push it to the cloud, and vice versa, which is sort of a backup. The two-way syncing, I think, is really complicated. I mean, I'm just very skeptical that that's going to work robustly.
But I mean, what's kind of surprising is you're saying Dropbox does work robustly for you, right?
Yes, but it's had decades of development at this point.
Sure.
Okay, this is one of these mistakes not to make, right? We're not going to reproduce.
I mean, I'm all for that. If you don't think we need it.
No, I think it'd be absolutely magnificent to have it. I just don't think it's very realistic to do it. I think there are many, many, many complicated atomicity issues, and it's just complicated. I mean, look, there are plenty of services that do the same kind of thing. I don't know whether there is, what we had looked at before was piggybacking on some existing mechanism or service. I mean, I assume we know that there is no API for Dropbox that would make this work. Is that true? Because that would require, the reason we can't do that is because it would require a piece of our cloud to be synchronized through Dropbox, which I assume we can't do. I assume a user could not declare, I assume the permissions will not work out so that a user could declare a piece of our cloud file system to be something that is synchronized with their Dropbox.
I'm pretty sure technically that would be possible.
No, I think we looked at this before, and there was some crippling cryptographic issue that made it impossible. But you see, that would be a much better solution. I mean, to me, if I could simply anoint some piece of our cloud file system to be, Dropbox synced, then that would be great. Now, of course, that more relates to your, okay, so here's a question. Is it possible to have a staging area in which we auto-sync from that staging area? Yeah, I don't know if that can possibly work. I don't think it's possible to get an external service to reach into a piece of our cloud. It seems implausible to me. It seems implausible that the permissions could possibly work out.
It couldn't actively push something into our cloud, probably not, no. But I mean, in a sense, we could run the Dropbox client on the cloud server if we have to. And
well, I don't think we can. I think there's a reason why that can't work. Okay, look, to my mind, this is, the priority of this relative to other things is unclear to me because I'm a little skeptical about this. I'm a little skeptical about whether this can be executed. I mean, and to me, we should discuss whether, what, I think Ethan just sent something through. Let's see if this works. Does this work? My God, is that a bitmap? What is that? What is that? Is that a bitmap?
More or less. I mean, it's not really a bitmap, but locators in graphics don't work. Yeah. Locator pane works, but not locator.
Seems like a thing to get working before we get CloudSync to work.
It's just something very, very different.
No, I understand.
There is work in that direction. Yeah, it's basically native graphics. That's the answer. And there's a lot of work in that direction.
Right. Right. Yes, I'm aware.
The bit of functionality that we'd really like to have is making backups and restores with the metadata. Right now, you can do copy directory to download and upload directories, but it's just the content file. So from a design perspective, CloudSync was kind of tying together those two things plus the promotion of local objects.
I don't believe in the promotion of local
objects. Into one function, but we could do cloud copy directory and have that be, with this metadata and everything.
Well, I think CloudSync is a fine name for the thing that moves a whole directory somewhere. I don't know, maybe it isn't the right name. I mean, cloud copy directory, you're saying, okay, so cloud copy directory, cloud to cloud or cloud to local?
Between cloud and local.
I suggest you implement that first. I mean, I just think the synchronization stuff is not going to work. That's why I think it's going to have corner cases. I think it's going to have very insidious bugs. I just don't think it's going to work.
Totally fair. I'm not going to argue with that.
But if what we're trying to do is a copy directory that, I mean, why doesn't copy directory store the metadata? Why doesn't it have an option to store the metadata?
I think that's part of the design question here. Do we even need a separate function? I think there's certainly a lot of cloud-specific stuff in that sense. Right?
Okay, hold on a second. If you say copy directory and you're copying directory from a cloud directory to a local directory, what's in that directory is up to the copier, so to speak. So if the copier chooses to put a dot file in that directory, I think it's its prerogative to do that. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, definitely. But then if we need to add cloud-specific options to cloud directory, that's what gets fuzzy.
I'm sorry, to what? To copy directory?
To copy directory, yeah.
Well, whether it's a separate function or not, I don't know. But I think that I don't see why when you send from copy directory from the cloud to local, the fact that it drops a dot file in that directory seems unproblematic. I mean, lots of programs drop lots of dot whatevers. I mean, dot lock files in some cases or whatever in directories. I don't think that's problematic. No, the question is the other way around. If you take a clean local directory and you copy it to the cloud, obviously the clean local directory does not have the cloud metadata file in it. So then the question is, then that is a case where you have to do some promotion process where you have to, we have to add in the cloud metadata during the copy directory.
Sure. Right. And so all those options that we have for functions that create cloud objects, those would need to get added to copy directory or have some syntax to specify permissions and actually in some cases MIME types. This file.
All right, well, let's look at that design, okay? But I think this is where we should be going initially. And I mean, I'm not sure what sync means. We could use that name for this. I don't think that would be terrible at all. I mean, it's something which has a bunch of additional hair associated with synchronizing with the cloud. As opposed to a pure copy directory, which would just copy the content without copying metadata and synchronizing and this, that, and the other. And I mean, the thing that what we do, we have to design the content of that Wolfram Cloud metadata file or whatever it is. And you have to then define, for example, permissions. If it's with UUIDs, fair enough. I mean, there's an interesting question. Should the permissions be user readable in that file or should they be UUIDs? Probably UUIDs is okay. I'm not thinking it through clearly enough to know. Yeah, I mean, I think that file should have some reasonable structure in it. And yeah, and that file, let's say that you had synced, okay, you've got a local directory. You know what? It should have the cloud-based directory in the name of the file. And we should have a separate file in the separate metadata file for every cloud. You see what I'm saying?
Okay.
Do you understand? Because otherwise what will happen is you've got a local file. Okay, let's say you're doing this. You've got your local directory. You sync it to cloud A. You then sync it to cloud B. Right? You then bring it back from cloud A. Bringing it back from cloud A should not mess with the metadata information for cloud B, should it? That's got to be thought through. I'm not sure. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yes. It's not obvious,
and also, as you go back and forth, if you add files in different places, are you getting the union of all files eventually? In other words, if you add a file on the cloud and then you sync it back again, are you just getting more and more and more files accumulating? Probably yes, although it might make a bit of a mess.
Right. In the unidirectional case, that's what the remove missing files option will be for, or whatever you want to call it.
Okay. All right, we have to wrap up here, but I think we've got a direction here. Let's roll back the incredibly ambitious version of this, okay? And I think we've got a version here which makes complete sense to me. I think there are some details to work out about how those dot files work and so on. Does this seem reasonable to you guys?
Yep, totally.
Okay, good, and that gives us more capacity to solve other problems. So this is all good. All right, thanks, guys, and see you later.